over his shoulder and my shoulder. We have with us Father Hugh Gillespie. He is going to be at St. Pius X Church this Saturday, beginning at the 8 a.m. Mass, beginning with the 8 a.m. Mass, ending at 3 o'clock. He's doing a day of recollection. And
so when you say this Saturday, you're talking tomorrow?
We're talking tomorrow.
Okay.
Tomorrow at St. Pius X, which is address is 217 South Sage Avenue in Mobile. I've been there many times. Lovely church, lovely parish. And he's with us to talk about that day of recollection and talk about what it is to be a Montefort missionary. Good morning, Father Gillespie.
Good morning.
Thanks for coming all the way down from, what did you come from Pennsylvania, or did you come from somewhere else on your way here?
I flew out of the metropolitan New York area.
Okay.
Because that's where he lives now.
That's where he lives now.
Yeah, I got that earlier.
I get that earlier. So we always like to start out giving a little bit of background about our guests. So before we actually get into the day of recollection and what a Montefort missionary is, can you give us some background on yourself and where you came from and how you became a priest?
Sure.
We only have an hour, so if it's a long time.
Then we'll try and condense it.
Okay.
Quite obviously, I wasn't born with the black shirt and the...
Wait a minute.
That would be amazing.
This is new information.
I'm originally from a small coal mining town in the northeastern corner of Pennsylvania. And when I was a younger man, this was the last thing on my mind.
So many priests say that.
In fact, my senior year in high school, I went to 12 years of Catholic school, first grade through high school. The priest who was teaching us religion looked at me and said, Hugh, if you ever take this seriously, you'd make a fine priest. And I looked at him and said, Father, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life.
I've just done 12 years of Catholic school, seriously.
I'm done.
And he reminds me of that every time he sees me now.
I was about to ask, do you ever get to see him?
But I had set my heart on a career in the sciences, and I left after high school to pursue that. I got a degree in physics and was 5 years into the PhD program in material science at the University of Wisconsin.
Wow.
When my life shifted direction. And when I began asking questions as a result of just getting more and more involved in the life of the Catholic Church on campus, I moved quickly into discerning the question of where's the energy of my life really going? And it was really helpful. A number of people just from the campus church had come up to me and said, have you ever thought about? And my answer initially was, well, no, not really, and I'm not planning to. But it did provoke something within me, and as more and more of my own time and energy and attention was being given to things related to the church, I had to put the question on the table of whether or not the Lord was possibly leading me in another direction. And as I began wrestling with that question, it worked out that, kind of falling back on the years of Catholic education that I had, always what attracted me in terms of studying the history of the faith was the model of the great preachers of the Middle Ages. And in the back of my mind, that was the picture of a vocational life that was attractive. And so very, very quickly, I had discerned that the Lord wasn't calling me to the more settled and stable vocation of diocesan priesthood.
Right.
But something much more mobile, itinerant, that involved the proclamation of his word. During that time, I was also introduced to the spirituality of the founder of my community, St. Louis de Montfort. And as I began growing and practicing that spirituality, it became so much a part of me that during my discernment in terms of which religious community to begin exploring, the vision of Father de Montfort's life and his preaching about Our Lady was lurking in the background. And so it worked out that when I had finally tracked down that small community that he had founded, the fit was a very, very good one. I entered the Company of Mary, which is our formal name. Commonly we're called the De Montfort Fathers or the Montfort Missionaries. Our formal name is the Company of Mary. And I left my doctoral studies aside and entered religious life in 1993.
Wow. Now, up until that time, did you have much of a relationship with the Blessed Mother?
Yes and no. It turns out that the motto of my high school, which was Marian Catholic, in Pennsylvania,
that's the dumbest question, Father, I've ever heard.
Ouch!
Come on.
was ad Jesum per Mariam, which is the motto of the Company of Mary as well.
I see that in the poster.
Okay,
That's on the
now wait a minute. That what was going on? Up until that point in time. I mean, were you? How would you describe your relationship with Mary? Because normally, when you run into someone who's in the company of Mary, it's because they've got this love relationship with her, and they're enticed by her. So, I mean, what was it? What was the catalyst?
How far back are we going with this? Are you asking?
I don't know. I
Okay.
don't know.
When I was growing up, was there anything in particular on a conscious thematic level with me? No, not particularly. But in my small town and where we grew up in Pennsylvania, we routinely said the rosary in Catholic school. I mean, Our Lady was just fundamentally a part of what we did. You didn't think about it.
Right.
Simply because that was very natural. And so that language of where did it come from on some levels doesn't neatly apply.
Okay.
But when I was a younger person, I was probably that person who would have been much more doing battle with questions of faith than comfortable with them.
Okay.
I absorbed the religious formation we had like a sponge. It wasn't a matter of not knowing my faith or not having received a good faith formation. But for me, on a deeply, deeply personal level, even very young, I was conscious of having an inability to resonate with the way prayer was taught and the way certain faith issues were presented. So it wasn't a question of doubting whether God existed, but a more fundamental question of wondering whether I could ever have a relationship with him. And as an adult, looking back later on with the benefit of my years of formation, I recognized that this wasn't a flaw in anything that was being taught to me, but it was the simple fact that I had a peculiar experience of the sacred that didn't dovetail neatly to some of the classical ways that religion is taught to children.
Okay.
And my experience tended to be much more transcendent, and so the really close-up, intimate categories of the spiritual life didn't work for me.
Did that come from your background of obviously the love of science? There's things that are very cut and dry, and you put these two things together and they make the other thing. But faith, not being outside of God, obviously, but sometimes is seen as a dichotomy. That faith is this warm, fuzzy thing, and the things that you're talking about, this relationship. But that in your mind, you seem to be like the scientist, where if it does not compute, how do I reconcile that? Was there a battle going on in terms of your intellect and the faith aspect?
No, not really. It was more a matter of, even as a child, I was very capable of abstract thought. And so I was more attracted to the abstract categories of faith. But when you teach children, more often than not, it's the very concrete pieces.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
And that was a little too close for me to work with easily. And so over time, it just took me a while to bring all the pieces together and to resolve all of that in a sense where I had a prayer life that I could recognize as a prayer life. And once that happened, then I was really free to begin a more full-on embrace and practice of my faith. Once that happened, again, Our Lady was naturally present in that. I didn't go out of my way to seek her. But I also didn't have, again, still a thematic, conscious relationship with her. And it was really my introduction to the works of St. Louis de Montfort that brought that piece into a central role in my own life of faith.
And that was during the doctoral studies?
Yes, it was.
Go ahead.
How were you introduced to True Devotion to Mary?
A couple things happened. First, and it's kind of curious sometimes how the Lord sets things up. It turns out that the young lady that I was dating at the time had ended up calling me one night, and she was just crying on the phone. And there was a violent religious argument in her family. Her sister had left the Catholic Church and married into a very militant, fundamentalistic sect. And apparently, just at dinner the night before, there's just sort of violent family argument about religious questions. And as happens so sadly and so frequently sometimes. And apparently, the most heated part of the argument was around devotion to Our Lady. And she had called me just because she just needed someone to talk to.
Right.
But she began asking me questions about, my sister said this, and what is it we believe? And I'm standing there on the other side of the phone thinking, well, I haven't really thought it sorted it out. But here's how I would begin approaching that. The next day, I'm coming out of daily mass. And there was a young man there who, about a month earlier, we weren't really close friends, but he was going through a hard time and needed a sympathetic ear, and I happened to be the ear. And so I talked through him through a rough patch. And to thank me, he reaches into his pocket and he says, I really enjoyed this book. I think you'd like it too. And he places in my hand a copy of Father de Montfort's True Devotion to the Holy Virgin Mary. And, I'm...
Then he says, Hugh, have you ever thought about becoming a priest?
So this was one of those where you look at it and you say, I know a 2x4 across the back of the head when I feel it.
Right.
That is great.
So I took the book home and I had a curious experience with it in that the beginning of the book had one of those really exaggerated, overly... one of those curious types of lives of the saints where it gave the biographies of Louis de Montfort, where it was one of those old school stressing the extraordinary at the price of giving you a real feel for the man.
Right.
So I almost stopped reading the book right there, just because the description of his life was so over the top that it made me question what else I was going to be reading. But it turned out that once I got into the work itself and could read Father de Montfort's own words, I was captivated almost as soon as I began reading.
Wow.
And so by the time I had finished the book, I had made the decision that I am going to find some way to learn, understand, and practice this spirituality. And so at that point, that was a real turning point for me in my life, that, this was a decisive spiritual step. What he's described here is something that I need to do. And it was, I felt claimed by the text. And, at that point, there was just no doubt for me that somehow this now needs to be a part of my life.
I felt claimed by the text. That's profound. That's beautiful. Father Hugh Gillespie, who will be at St. Pius X Church tomorrow from
8 a.m. Mass.
8 a.m. Mass and ending approximately at 3, so a day of recollection. And you're supposed to bring your own sack lunch, but refreshments and drinks and desserts throughout the day are provided by the Legion of Mary.
Desserts.
Desserts. It's going to be delightful. It's just a wonderful time. It will be a game changer. It will be an eternity changer. I promise anyone, if you have a strong power,
Sorrowing most of all because of the word he had spoken.
brought, and I start crying like crazy.
It's my friend's grandparents.
Whenever I read that passage,
That's what's going to happen when Father Gillespie leaves St. Pius X.
it's going to get crazy.
It's going to be people grabbing his leg. And that.
Don't go, Father!
In studio, Father Hugh Gillespie, who will be at St. Pius X tomorrow, starting with the 8 a.m. Mass, and it's a day of recollection. Day of recollection, which will end approximately 3 p.m., the hour of mercy.
That's right.
So you've been talking about your life, but can you tell us a little bit more about your family life? Was there anything that you look back and say, yeah, now I can see where God was kind of planting the seeds for priesthood there?
I'm from a small family. Both of my parents were older. They're actually closer in age to most of my friends' grandparents. My mother and father both lived through the Depression. My dad's a World War II vet. And he was a steel worker. And I only have one brother, so we were a very small family, and devout. So Mass every Sunday was very important. And in fact, it wasn't just Mass every Sunday, but my dad had to be there half an hour early.
Amen. I like this guy.
And on some levels, again, looking back on it now, well, I didn't think anything was happening. A large part of my spiritual life was forged by getting to church half an hour early, and my brother and I would kneel down and just to fill the time. would go over the prayers that we knew.
You see that? Listeners, are you paying attention?
And and even reading through the old people's mass books and just the words of the songs.
Nice.
So it just turned out that years later I have this repertoire from my childhood that no one ever taught me directly, but that I picked up just from the bulletins in the church. I was very edified by the example of the two priests we had in my small town. Had two Catholic churches.
Wow.
And still has two Catholic churches.
Praise God.
The two priests growing up were just both in very different ways remarkable men. And so even when I wasn't practicing as fully when I was away at college initially, when I came home, I went to church on my own, and in no small measure out of respect. I had no doubt that these men absolutely believed everything they said, and that quality and authenticity of witness was very important for me, more so than the need to hear anything that I wanted to hear. I needed to see a man who believed what he was saying, and I got that from both of the priests back home. From my childhood, there's one memory, and I can't say that it was a spur on the road to the priesthood, but it was certainly a spur on the road to faith. And I only had this memory once. My dad was a very, very private man, a very shy man. And so we could spend an hour with one another and be very comfortable, but we wouldn't even say a word. But one evening, I remember I was in about seventh grade. I happened to be walking down the hallway of the house, and the bedroom door to him and my mom's room was open, which was unusual at that point. And my dad was actually kneeling by the bed praying. It's the only time I ever saw it. Because again, he was very, very private. There was no question about his faith, but that was something he did privately. But that one time that I saw it, I've never forgotten that image of him kneeling by the bed, his head bowed down, and this strong man who didn't bow to anyone, bowing before the Lord. And again, the sheer genuineness of the gesture sat with me.
That's beautiful.
Well, you talk about the influence of those two priests, and especially, at least in the particular story you were talking about, is the way they spoke and the way that you knew that they were holy and honest in the words they spoke. And now you are one who goes around and speaks to others about the faith and about Mary. Does that influence of those two priests in terms of how they speak? Does that come out through you, either consciously or subconsciously, when you talk? Because that is what you do as a missionary priest, is you go and you give and you preach to people and you give them the truth and you give them, through your words. Did they influence you still when you think about them?
There is no good preacher who doesn't rip his predecessors off on a regular basis.
Amen.
Let me just be blunt about that. Any good preacher learns from those he's been exposed to. And so every time I get up to preach, there are probably about half a dozen voices in the background on anything I say. I knew I arrived as a preacher when one of our men who had been preaching parish missions for 25 years came up to me and said, "Hugh, I ripped you off the other day."
I've made it.
You're like, now I know.
So let's, I guess, start getting into what kind of things do you reflect on as you go around and talk? Is it mostly Marian flavored, or is it just basically based on where you're going and what they happen to be talking about during that day of recollection?
It's a bit of both. The Blessed Virgin is present in everything I do, even if she's not the topic. And so the Marian aspect of the Montfortian charism, that just comes with the package. But the kind of preaching that we do in the company of Mary, much like Father de Montfort, is we are really founded to be missionaries, not who bring the gospel to those who haven't heard it before, but those missionaries the church sends to itself to bring the gospel again to those who have already heard it. And so our vocation is the renewal of the baptismal vocation of the people of God. And in that context, we're often invited to do retreats for young people or for different parish groups, parish missions, retreats for other organizations, for example, the Legion of Mary. And typically, a number of times a group will come and they're not asking for, could you come in and give us 6 days in a row of Marian catechesis?
Right.
But they might be saying, would it be possible to do something for the families of the parish? And then what we would try to do is we would structure our preaching. We don't have an infinite repertoire, but to the extent that we can, for example, I will take, of the 13 or 14 topics I might be able to do for you, I'll take the 4 or 5 that I think best fit what you've just said, and then arrange how we do things in such a way that we can address that need. And then, some of the preaching will have a place for Our Lady. Others won't mention her explicitly, but she'll be part of the prayer. And so Montfortian preaching works that way. It's the recognition that Our Lady is intrinsically involved in the full flowering of a Christian vocation. And so she becomes a part and parcel of everything we offer and everything we do, even if, as I said, she's not the explicit topic of the day.
Well, without giving too much away, can we talk about tomorrow, the lineup? I mean, it starts with 8 a.m. Mass.
Yes. And following the Mass, as we move into the prayer and reflection part of the day, we'll focus on a number of basic elements. And the first is to talk about why devotion to Mary is not merely important, but in fact an absolute necessity.
Amen.
And because again, while we believe that, while we say that, it's also important to just know how we ground that in the very nature of Christian life itself and in the very life of the church. And so we'll begin with that. Why is devotion to Mary necessary? What does it mean to say that? And when we recognize, rightly understood what that means, what kind of difference can that make in our Christian living? From that, following the line of thought of St. Louis de Montfort himself, the question is, if I've just demonstrated that devotion to Mary is important, then it's important to get the right kind of devotion to Our Lady, an authentic or a true devotion to the Blessed Virgin. And so we'll talk first about some classic mistakes, some ways, not just devotion to Mary, but the spiritual life itself can get short-circuited. Because when we know the mistakes, we can prevent ourselves from making them, but we also then narrow the field down to begin recognizing what are the marks of authentic devotion. And that'll be the real high point of the day, where we begin speaking about what are the characteristics of genuine devotion to Mary in whatever form it takes. And just to add a clarification here, when we talk about Father de Montfort's book, True Devotion to the Holy Virgin Mary, Father de Montfort in that book is not speaking of one devotion. He's speaking of what are the marks that allow you to identify any devotion to Mary as true or not.
Okay.
And
So no single path, but it depends on the person and how it's reflected in them.
exactly, for Father de Montfort, it's important to recognize that upon the true baseline of Marian devotion that the Church has, you can build many legitimate devotional and spiritual structures. But for them to be true, they all would have to have certain characteristics that he identifies. And these are just great benchmarks in terms of the elements of a healthy spiritual life. And so they're valuable discernment tools. Then Father de Montfort would say, from having a true devotion, and this is very important, from having a true devotion, I have some kind of stable relationship with Our Lady that is authentic, there can be a desire to live that true devotion perfectly. And it's when he speaks about this notion of a perfect relationship with Our Lady that he would introduce the idea that he's famous for in the modern world, which is the idea of consecration to Our Lady. And so true devotion and consecration are different things for Father de Montfort. You want to have a true devotion before you embark on something like a total consecration of yourself to Our Lady. Because if you don't know her, if your relationship with her isn't stable at least, how can you give us a complete gift of yourself?
That is a great understanding of it. That's beautiful. Wow. You know what I'd like to do? Let's take our second break for the news, and when we come back, can we talk more about that and talk about Marian consecration?
Yes, we can.
That'd be great. We have with us in studio Father Hugh Gillespie.
The humble beginnings of this human. Pope Francis spoke.
Everything I have to believe.
Patrick's at the command center. Station manager Dave. Looking forward here, Father.
Pretty much
My Latin is horrible. Help me out.
ad Jesum per Mariam,
Which means
to Jesus through Mary.
tomorrow at St. Pius X Church, starting at 8 a.m. Mass, and will end approximately 3 p.m., the hour of mercy. Bring a sack lunch. What age groups are you looking for here, Father?
Pretty much all of them.
Now, wait a minute.
Come on, come on.
I have a 2.5-year-old.
We can work with that.
I'll send my wife with the van.
Yeah.
Da, 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 da. You know, right now they're putting in a new floor at St. Lawrence Church across the street. So daily mass has been in. So that's why I'm kind of saying that, because if you show up with a 2.5-year-old, people turn around.
To Our Lady is a very, very.
So can we talk about Marian consecration? Can we talk about St. Louis de Montfort? Like, he wasn't the one that invented this, correct?
Correct. In fact, the idea of a consecration to Our Lady is a very, very old idea. And Father de Montfort himself, when he was in the seminary, picked up a book called by the great spiritual writer Henri Boudin called God Alone, the Holy Slavery to the Admirable Mother of God.
Wow.
And that book very strongly influenced him. And at the end of that book was a prayer of total consecration to the Blessed Virgin. The great French spiritual theologian Pierre Cardinal de Bérulle was a proponent of consecration to Our Lady, as was Saint Jean Eudes, Jacques Ollier of Saint Sulpice. There were many.
There's a lot of French people.
Good grief.
I'm noticing there's a theme going here.
Well, Father de Montfort is considered to be the last great example of the so-called French school of spirituality. And one of the fulcrums of the French school of spirituality involved a devotion to the incarnation of the Lord, and included this idea of consecration in honor of the great dependence that he had in the womb of the Blessed Virgin Mary.
Oh, that's beautiful.
And if you pay close attention to the long act of total consecration that's associated with Father de Montfort, you'll see that he makes that explicit. I do this in honor of and in union with your dependence on Our Lady, O Lord. But before that, you would see among some of the earlier Jesuit writers, and then coming out of the broader Christian tradition of devotion to Our Lady, consecratory prayers of some form. But Marian consecration, in the sense of a total act of self-gift, really comes to its full flowering in France in the 17th and 18th centuries.
So what is, you talked about the kind of the baseline for devotion, and that can look, a devotion can look different for different people, but has some different basics and baselines. What does a consecration look like in a person's life?
Okay, now we want to be very, very careful here, because consecration is one of those words that's used with a lot of sloppiness today. People say, for example, Our Lady of Fatima called for consecration to her Immaculate Heart. And so, well, St. Louis de Montfort talked about consecration, and the assumption is they're the same thing.
Right.
These are not, okay? The particular consecration associated with St. Louis de Montfort is not a general consecration. For example, parents can't use this to consecrate their children to the Virgin Mary. Because it's the kind of act that can only be made by an individual. You can't make a total self-gift on behalf of anybody else.
Amen. Yeah, that makes sense.
There are other forms of consecration that parents can pray for their children, which don't have that total form to it. Next, for St. Louis de Montfort, it is both for everybody and not for everybody. And what he means by that is that this is a very serious step that you make in the spiritual life. And so you can't make it lightly. And so his assumption, again, is the first thing you need to do is to get the baseline of a relationship with Our Lady. If you don't have that, it's not that it's a bad thing to pick up a preparation for consecration book and do it, but you're not going to have much of a chance of getting to its fullness.
Right. And I will admit on a personal level, Father Hugh, that that's exactly what happened to me when I was in college. I was 19 years old and everybody was like, hey, Todd, you going to consecrate yourself to the Blessed Mother? Everybody's doing this. I mean, it's good. It's positive
Peer
peer
pressure,
pressure. Yeah, but I read the book. I said the prayers. I mean, I did it to the letter of the law. But after the consecration, it wasn't as if I was in some sort of, I mean, some of these people were talking about, oh, I feel like I'm in an espoused relationship with the Blessed Mother now. And I'm thinking, I don't feel anything.
Right. And again, one of the things that's just a natural temptation with something like this is to almost force yourself to feel. In fact, St. Louis de Montfort even cautions in his writings of not seeking for felt consolations. But to have that pure faith of believing without feeling, which is one of the great manifestations of faith.
Yeah, yeah.
But so for St. Louis de Montfort, though, the issue is if I have a stable relationship with Our Lady, if I've put together a basic participation which is steady and constant in the life of the church, and in doing that, if I feel the tug in my heart to want to take this to a deeper, a more perfect level, that's the best launching point for considering something like an act of consecration. The other forms of consecration, which are not so total, are better for that person who's just beginning to forge a relationship with Our Lady. And, so one of the recommendations is start there. Start there and get some stability in your faith life and get comfortable with Mary in your spiritual life. Because the total consecration begins with the desire to live Marian devotion perfectly. And by definition, you have to have the devotion to begin with so you can have that desire.
I think that's a really important point because we don't want to feel like pressured, like the other guy is doing it. We must not be as holy, or we must not be as devoted to Mary if we're not ready for consecration. So you might do something so it is for everyone, but not for everyone, because they might not be at that place yet to do that.
Exactly. It's not for everybody at every given moment in time.
Right.
In fact, the best preparation is first build Our Lady into your prayer life. If you're really interested in this, pick up either one of two books by St. Louis de Montfort. The best book is True Devotion to the Blessed Virgin, where he outlines in the greatest detail, both in general what devotion to Mary consists in, and then more specifically in the second half of the book, what perfect devotion to Our Lady consists in. And Father de Montfort, again, did not use the term consecration like we do it today.
Right.
The devotion was holy slavery as far as he was concerned. I think that's a tough term, but it encapsulates that sense of total radical belonging and self-surrender that he's really pointing to. The foundation for this is participation in the life of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ shares everything with us, including who he is. And who is Jesus? Son of God and Son of Mary. And so for St. Louis de Montfort, I need to learn to open my life completely to receive all that Jesus gives me. And the best way to do that is to live fully as a son of Mary, just like Jesus.
Wow.
It's not Mary who gives me Jesus for St. Louis de Montfort. It's Jesus who, in giving me himself, gives me a relationship with his Blessed Mother.
I remember my spiritual director many years ago, excuse me, when we were talking about the relationship with the Blessed Mother, and this was already a year past my consecration, which, like I said, was kind of dry, and I really wasn't prepared for it, honestly. I mean, I did not have the relationship with the Blessed Mother that I needed to have before I consecrated myself to her. But he was complimenting me and affirming me. He said, I think you're finally developing the relationship that you need with your mother. And I love the way he said that. And then he asked me the question. He said, how often do you cry with her? And I went, huh? He goes, how often do you cry with her? And that's not the exact indicator. I mean, it's not what says, oh, now you have a relationship with her. But I walked away from that and I said, I've never cried with her up until that point. And now I do a lot. So I figure I think I'm on the right path.
Very good. Very good.
Now, in the closing minutes here, what kind of invitation would you give to our listeners to join you tomorrow for this day of recollection?
If you're listening to this program in the first place, you have an interest in the Catholic Church and in living your faith and taking your faith very seriously. I can say with absolute certainty that the secret to a fully alive Christian life has a name, and her name is Mary.
Amen.
There is great value when we come together to seek to grow in our faith, but coming together to get to know Our Lady more fully. That whether I have a relationship with Our Lady now or not, whether I'm not sure how the pieces fit together, or whether I feel fairly comfortable with her, I urge you to come out. Come out to learn, come out to share what you have with others, but come out because we will not just speak about knowing Our Lady, we will be celebrating her. And that is a very, very important thing. When we speak about knowing Our Lady in the spiritual way, we are not speaking simply of knowing what the Catechism says about her. We have to know that. But we're speaking about a personal knowledge of Our Lady. And that is going to be the focus of everything we do tomorrow.
Wow. Man,
If-
see,
if-
now
if-
I'm mad that I can't go.
I know. If you're not fueling up the car right now, and getting your breakfast ready to head out tomorrow morning, starts tomorrow morning 8 a.m. with the 8 a.m. mass at St. Pius X, and that is again address is at 217 South Sage Avenue in Mobile, just off of Airport Drive. Make a right on Airport, left on Sage. It's right there. It's a day of recollection ending at 3 p.m. Bring your own sack lunch. And
If you do have any questions at all, you can call Cecilia.
yeah, at 251-227-3704. 251-227-3704. Cecilia Wilson will answer all your questions. She'll tell you the dessert menu, the refreshments, and yes.
There's also something in Black Down Bold regarding he'll be there also on Sunday too.
Oh, that's right. So if you are a parishioner at St. Pius X, or if you want to go over there for Mass, he'll actually be speaking at the classes between the Masses on Sunday as well. So it's all Father Hugh Gillespie all the time here in the Archdiocese
I
of
know,
Mobile.
and I'll be at the Archdiocese Catholic Youth Conference, which will be wonderful, but still,
Well, then he'll have to come back.
there's too many events.
We'll have
Father
to.
Hugh, thanks so much for being with us this morning. We really